Hello, welcome to today's webinar, Deep Dive into Rural SARTs. This is one webinar that is part of the SART Toolkit, and this webinar and all of the webinars in the toolkit were produced with the support from OVC. And we just want to say that the opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this webinar are those of the contributors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the United States Department of Justice. You can find a lot more resources for rural SARTs, for any SART actually, and a lot of content information and list of subject matter experts at the SART Toolkit, and that can be found at www.nsvrc.org/SART Toolkit. Today our focus is really on rural SARTs, and we're talking with some folks who are on rural SARTs or coordinate SARTs and work with rural SARTs. So Katie, I'm going to turn it over to you for your introduction.
Okay, thank you, Christina. So I am Katie Hughes with the Wyoming Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. And I've been with the coalition for about 4.5 years now, and I live and work from a home office in, they call it extreme rural Wyoming. And so for part of my work, I get to really love programs to life, helping communities and advocates across Wyoming develop SART teams, as well as increase their network for sexual assault nurse examiners and PREA resources across Wyoming. Really kind of just creating space for communities and advocates to create some change in their communities.
Hi, this is Johnanna. I'm going to go ahead. So this is Johnanna Ganz. I work for the Sexual Violence Justice Institute. I am the Rural Projects Coordinator, and what that all means is that we are an OVW-funded technical assistance provider, and my position is national in scope. So while our office is based in St. Paul, Minnesota, I spend an extraordinary amount of time talking with and traveling to rural communities across the U.S. and in the U.S. territories. And I provide anything ranging from one phone conversation or an email to send out a resource, all the way up to on-site visits to do trainings or to do what's called a more formal site visit and help folks figure out how do we want to build strong and sustainable SARTs, especially in rural communities.
Great, and Marsha, can you provide your introduction?
Hi, my name is Marsha Kisner. I am the Rural Services Project Coordinator with the West Virginia Foundation for Rape Information and Services. I work to develop services in rural areas throughout the state of West Virginia. West Virginia is predominantly a rural state, and in a lot of our more remote areas, we do not have existing services. So I also serve as a SART coordinator to advocates that are working in that area to develop services to provide a 100% inclusive response to sexual assault and stalking victims in rural areas.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for being here today. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your experiences. We know a lot of SARTs across the country, states and territories are in rural or frontier areas. And there's a lot of conversations and people kind of asking, like, what does it mean to be rural? So can Johnanna, will you start us off just explaining, when you talk about rural, what does that mean?
Sure. So when I think about rural, and when I talk about rural, because as a rural projects coordinator, I end up talking about being rural quite a bit. There's a couple ways that you can go about defining it. And so you can go the traditional route of looking at population and saying, well, there's less than 50,000 people present in a single location, therefore it is a rural space. But rural is oftentimes much bigger than that. there's a bunch of different types of being rural. And so when I'm talking to people about rural and rural communities, I often talk more about rural spaces than communities, because oftentimes a lot of rural spaces, they have a collection of people, but there's no central gathering point, or there's a limited central gathering point. And so spaces tends to be a little bit more inclusive. And so when I talk about rural spaces, I talk about the different types of rural spaces. So there is an isolated rural space or community, right? And that means that they are physically, there's physically challenges to traveling to that community. So for example, some island communities are designated as an isolated community, because they are self-sustaining essentially, because they have to be in many ways, because it is difficult to travel. There are communities and spaces up in literal mountains, right? That's isolated. There's also remote communities, and those, when you use the term remote, it often just indicates that they are far from a major metropolitan area. And then finally, we can talk a little bit about what it means to be frontier land, and that is traditionally used by government entities, and there is a lot of conversation about the ways in which frontier land is a complicated term for a lot of folks, but frontier suggests and is defined as less than 6 people per square mile of land. And then finally, the last thing that really comes out of rural communities when we're thinking about, like, what does it mean to be rural, is so many Native and American Indian reservations were relocated to deeply, deeply rural, isolated, remote frontier lands. And so whenever we talk about rural, on some level, we also have to be talking about tribal lands in a lot of instances. So that's, in a nutshell, what I mean when I talk about rural, and some of the ways you can think about it, I talk about rural.
Thanks, Johnanna. Marsha, did you have something to add to that?
I think she summed that up quite well. The only thing that I would add to that is a lot of times when you hear the term rural, you think negative, like far out, geographic isolation. And a lot of times, I mean, sometimes that is the certainly rural area, but a lot of times it just means you have to travel a little further to get those services. It doesn't mean that those services doesn't exist. What it means to be rural to me is fabulous. I mean, a lot of countryside, especially here in West Virginia. There are a lot of things that we don't have in rural land, in rural towns, but there are a lot of things that we do have. We just have to make do with the resources that are available.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. Katie, do you want to add anything?
I think both Johnanna and Marsha did a great job talking about rural. And for our communities here in Wyoming, I would just add that it also seems to be a way of being together, kind of more of like a cultural definition of rural, in that, like, we deeply understand that our culture is impacted by the lands that we inhabit, and the colonial aspects that come into that in our connection to the lands, as well as how we move together through space and across distances, and find really creative ways to connect and to be in community with one another, even though we are oftentimes so very isolated. So there's, I think, a lot of pride that goes into rural communities, but also that dynamic of knowing that we are not often, and largely in Wyoming, the population is not the original inhabitants of the land, and that's something that definitely comes up in our conversations in SART teams.
Thanks. Thinking about what you just said, where there's a lot of distance, I get questions all the time about, particularly in rural environments, where we can't do anything without everyone at the table. Who needs to be at the table? Or we've spent the last 5 years trying to get so-and-so at the table, and what does that look like? Johnanna, will you talk to us a little bit about, how you would help folks kind of, especially in rural communities, through that as a technical assistance provider?
Yeah, absolutely. I get this question also quite a bit, particularly around the issue of, well, we need absolutely everyone, or we haven't been able to get that person. And fundamentally, one of the very first things that I always talk about with who is on your rural SART is, who do you actually have? So not the people you can't get. Who do you actually have? And what kind of good work can you do together right now? So many communities and spaces, there are elected officials positions, just like prosecutors or district attorneys or sheriffs, or the list kind of goes on. There's a lot of elected positions. If it's anything like the areas that I grew up in, those people stay in those positions until they retire, um, right? Essentially, until they retire or die. There's no nice way to say that, right? So people stay in these positions for really long times. And so if you have a particular person who's resistant, let's say it's an advocacy organization that is, they just don't want to participate, or you have a medical care provider who says, absolutely not, we don't have time, we can't do that thing. That's your opportunity. If you've done your best to get them on board and have them come with you, and they just won't for whatever reason, that's a really amazing opportunity for you to say, okay, let's do good work together then. And there are just like profound things that you can do because you're capturing the existing momentum, right? That momentum that is available to you for the people who are excited. And so, of course, ideally, you want your core, 5 disciplines. So advocacy, medical professionals, law enforcement, prosecution or a district attorney, and corrections or probation. Those are your ideals, right, as your core group who are responding to changes in the criminal justice system. But there's also opportunities for a lot of auxiliary partners. So folks who impact our disclosure processes and the ways that we go about getting people services. And those folks can do really great work with you. And you can use that good work as an opportunity to then uphold that really great work and go back to that community partner a little while later and say, look at all of the really amazing work that we've done. Would you like to join us in doing this good work? And so that's something that I always talk about when people are like, oh, we can't get everybody, or, we can't get this one person. Use who you do have, do good work now, and then open up the door again later.
This is Katie, and I love that, Johnanna. We had a SART team that was really struggling to get their prosecutor on board, and they hadn't had a successful case prosecuted in like 30 years. And I mean, yeah, it was causing a lot of trauma for survivors who were never ever able to receive any justice in the community. And so what the SART team did was pull together and say, well, we're going to do it anyway, and we're going to construct like high-level activities, high-leverage activities that are going to really create the space for the prosecutor to understand that we're serious about doing this regardless. And we're going to be releasing press releases to the community. And we're going to get people involved in new ways. And we're going to ask what justice means to our community if we haven't had a successful case prosecuted in 30 years. And just in doing that, the prosecutor decided that they wanted in on that conversation, right? And then they assigned an attorney just to focus on sexual assault prosecution. And that's like a very, very rural community. And just over the course of a year, that was able to happen. But it took some time to get people into that place where they were ready to take action and move forward, regardless of whether that prosecutor was willing to participate in the conversation or not. But I would just echo that that is possible, and asking the questions of what do we want to do and what can we do to move forward together, even if people aren't ready to be at the table, then that's okay, and great things can come of that.
Hi, this is
Thanks,
Marsha.
Marsha. Did you have anything?
Yeah, I would just like to Yes, I would just like to add, just to reiterate what Johnanna said, that just because all the players didn't show up for the game doesn't mean that you forfeit the game. Sometimes you have to create a different playbook. And that being said, we have a county that the hospital absolutely refused to call an advocate for whatever many reasons they gave. And the law enforcement officer that sits with the SART team took it upon themselves that anytime they were contacted that there was a sexual assault that was reported, they would call the advocate out. So there's ways around that when someone doesn't see a need to be at the table, and eventually they when the community is doing good things and it's noticed that they're not present, that usually changes.
Great, well, thank you. So now that we know who might be on a rural SART or kind of how to move forward when not everybody's at the table, I think the other question that people ask all the time is how do you form a rural SART, right? So we just talked about some of the tricks and tips when you don't get everybody there, but what are some of the key attributes when you kind of initially set out to think about creating that space and think about doing the invitations, think about overcoming some of those maybe transportation or other barriers that you talked about at the very beginning of this conversation. And Katie, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, so this has been a learning process for me over the last couple of years. And at first when I really accepted this role in coordinating SART pilot communities across Wyoming, I was just so excited that I wanted to go and get started and dive in. And so we called people together and we started meeting. And I really loved the SART Toolkit because that was my main resource that I went to, right? Like, how do I form a SART? Okay, I've got these boxes. I'm going to start checking them. But in that, I failed to really stop and get to know the community and really give some space for the community to understand their needs before just like identifying that these are the best practices and let's go ahead and follow them, right? Without first asking how the boxes fit with the community and who will be impacted by the decisions that we're making and have we heard from them, and really like understanding what are the intended consequences that we need to consider. And so it's been a process for really me in helping and supporting rural SARTs to understand that we really need to dive in deeply with why are we wanting to form a SART and what are the needs are, and have we heard from survivors to understand how we are going to work together to really change the social norms that are existent in our community and to deconstruct some of them, hoping to reduce the impact of trauma rather than to recreate it within the SART itself, right? So that's been a process, and I think really when SARTs are forming, it's really important to be asking everyone at the table who is not at the table and why might not they be present, and then also to understand like what are we centering around and what are we wanting to achieve here, and do we have the voices that are needed to make sure that that's possible.
Thanks, Katie. Johnanna, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. Katie did a great job talking about, how do we form and the sorts of ways that we form and who is present at the table. Just to kind of add on to that, a lot of communities get folks to the table because they see other communities doing a SART. In some states, there are legal mandates that actually require SARTs to meet and outlines what their SART is going to be doing and how they're going to be doing it. Some communities have and decide to move forward with the SART and get people to the table because they have great pre-existing relationships, or because they already have another team that's focused on, for example, like a CCR, where it's focused on domestic violence, and they see that sexual violence is not being properly addressed in their community. And so they say, hey, we know that the SART thing exists, let's do it together. So fundamentally, folks in communities and spaces, they see teams as, specifically SART teams, as really valuable, even if they don't quite know what it is they want to accomplish or how they want to go about doing the work. They just know that like this is a place that we have to do good work, and we have to address the really extraordinary injustices that are happening in our community around sexual violence. And so that's always really heartening to see. But yeah, that's those are some of those extra ways that, particularly in the national scope, that I see people coming to the table and getting everyone there and saying, okay, we got to do this SART thing. Let's figure out how to do it together.
Great, thank you. Marsha, have you had any experience forming SARTs, and what are kind of your tips and tricks that you share with folks?
Yes, absolutely. When I started doing this work about 11 years ago, one of the objectives that I had to on my grant was to form SARTs in some of the counties in rural West Virginia where no SARTs were existent. And what I would like to say is that every SART is going to look different. There's no cookie cutter SART at all. Just because one county SART may have 25 people, in a rural SART you may have 7. It just depends. That doesn't mean that they're not doing a good job. That doesn't mean that people don't want to participate. It just means that law enforcement agencies are smaller in rural areas. Sometimes there's one law enforcement officer. Those SARTs look somewhat different. We have SARTs that feel like they're not successful because they have key members missing, and that's not the case. Some of those SARTs are flourishing. So I would say that just don't base your SART on what the next county over SART looks like, and address in your county, where are the victims going to seek help? If you look at the points of entry as to where victims can turn whenever they've been sexually assaulted, that'll help you decide who needs to be at the table.
I just want to bounce on Marsha. Oh my gosh, absolutely. Like, totally with you. There is no cookie cutter SART, and just like 100% agree on that. And to your point about what are your points of disclosure, I've worked with communities where faith leaders are their points of disclosure. And so they have to involve a faith leader in a criminal justice system based group. They have to involve a faith leader because that's their primary point of disclosure for the community. And so if you can get those folks in the ways that it really meets the need for the community, that's part of building that unique, not cookie cutter SART.
Thanks, Johnanna. I really appreciate that. I think a lot of times folks think there's a really specific right way to do a SART, and I think over and over, the question that I always find myself asking people is, what does your community look like? Who's around? And, who's excited, right? I think there's that SART champion that often is the person who helps the magic happen in a community, and I think a lot of your answers really reflect that. I might have jumped ahead a slide here. We just chatted about how rural SARTs form. And one of the things that we want to ask you, and I think all of you in our work together and in any conversation I've had with you, a lot of people always talk to me about the barriers in rural communities. And I really appreciate, I think something from all 3 of you is the way that you look at rural spaces not as, I think Joanna used this language, not as research poor, but resource rich, and just really kind of thinking about changing that mindset and then kind of looking around and seeing what that means. Johnanna, will you talk a little bit more about that and talk about the way that you see and experience opportunities in rural communities?
Yes, absolutely I will. It's one of my favorite conversation topics, even at parties when I'm not at work. So when I talk about rural and when I talk about doing SART work, I do talk about it as resource rich. And I think that's something that we don't always necessarily see. And so when I was a SART leader, because I served as a SART leader, I worked for a primarily urban team that had some suburban rural community. And when they talked about suburban and rural community, they talked about everything that those folks didn't have. And even when I moved to national technical assistance, even in those conversations, I often hear folks talk about all the things that rural doesn't have. Um, I just wanted every single time. It does not always win me friends at parties, but every single time I come back and say, well, there's lots of things that urban communities do not have and will never have that a rural community and space does. And so I think it's a really important message that we start reframing our conversations about whatever community type that you're in, whether it's rural, suburban, micro-urban, metropolitan, whatever it is. And we look at every single community and say, where are the challenges and where are our opportunities and resources? Because when we start looking at where are our opportunities and resources, we can start really creatively addressing those barriers that exist for every single community. And so that's always my favorite part about, talking with, and working with rural communities and spaces and folks, is that some of the coolest, most creative solutions have come out of this idea of, well, there isn't somebody else to do it. If we don't figure out how to make this work, we can't rely on another agency because there is no other agency. So let's work together and find out how to do that. And one example that I have that I just absolutely adore comes out of the Panhandle of Florida. So working with the SART communities down there and working with their SART lead down there, the coolest. It just still blows my mind. So they have a very large population of immigrants up in the Panhandle, and they knew that their traditional advocacy services were not reaching these immigration camps, essentially, and encampments, because they didn't have appropriate tools to connect with folks. And they knew that there was a lot of violence happening. Like, they fundamentally knew, because there were reports coming back of sexual violence against workers who felt like they couldn't report and couldn't connect to traditional advocacy or criminal justice services because they'll be deported, because some of them were undocumented immigrants, right? There was violence happening within the encampments themselves. And again, feel like they can't report because they don't want to get someone else deported. They don't want to be deported, right? There's so many barriers in that regard, and there's linguistic barriers, etc. And so one of the ways that the advocacy community addressed this barrier was by hiring a bilingual SART and coming up with these business cards that would say, like, haircuts by Johnanna. And that's all it says on it. And folks could give out these cards and say, if you need help, call this number. And so sometimes that advocate, of course, would get phone calls and be like, hello, I would like to schedule a 5 p.m., cut and color, right? And once those messages came through, they're like, okay, this isn't a real, this isn't the call for us. So they would then refer to a local salon. But for everyone else who's carrying that card who had it, anyone who stopped them would see, okay, it's just a haircut card. But then they could call and say, hey, I need help. Hey, I need to report. Hey, I need X, Y, and Z, to get some sense of justice in a really unjust environment. And so that to me is so creative. And I, having led a primarily urban SART, we had 3 separate community advocacy agencies, all that just singularly focused on particularly Latinx communities, right? So I didn't have to deal with that. I didn't have to deal with trying to, figure out how to provide services to a lot of folks who were bilingual, because I could just call one of my sister agencies or sibling agencies and say, hey, we have this survivor who primarily speaks English. Spanish. Can we get them connected with you folks and get them on your caseload to get them the services that they need that are most appropriate, right? And so that is, in a nutshell, that for me really sums up the ways in which that really clever, creative ways that SARTs operate in rural communities and spaces comes through. The other thing that I would just want to wrap up with is that particularly when being a SART leader, actually a leader of any kind, but truly in SART work, our work is really hard. And we see a lot of terrible cases that don't have great outcomes. And so sometimes, particularly for rural SART leaders, I talk with them that we're in the business of building hope and possibility. And if we look at things as just resource, like lacking resources rather than resource rich, we can't build that hope and possibility with others. And so that's always my advice. Look for where you can see hope and possibility for a better system, a better outcome, a better way of living for all of your service providers and for victim survivors in your community. Because that reframe toward opportunity is absolutely critical in sustaining this work for the long haul.
Thanks, Johnanna. I really appreciate that. Katie, do you have any thoughts about the way that you and your community have accessed your opportunities and leveraged those?
Yeah. First, I want to say, Johnanna, that was beautiful, and I'm just really supportive of everything that you said. And the imagination that goes in to rural communities for them to create solutions is just phenomenal to see. So thank you for sharing that. That made my morning. And so what I love about doing SART work in rural communities is that we're able to connect in a way that I don't know is possible in urban communities, right? Like, so with our Department of Corrections, we've been working to really figure out how are we responding in correction facilities to sexual assault, and recognizing that the coalition ourselves, we haven't been present in that work for far too long, and that is a fault of ours, right? And so we were able to just reach out and say, hey, we recognize that we have not done our jobs. We have not supported survivors in a space that was most needed, right? And then in making that call, we were just able to say, like, let's build a relationship and let's see if we want to do something new. And we were able to kind of remove the barriers just by being vulnerable and just by like really giving space for Department of Corrections to come into this work with us, and then to do some visioning around like what could we do together. And in asking that question, what could we do together, the opportunities were endless, right? Like even in 2 years, we were able to apply for grants with Just Attention International and figure out who in the facilities and who in the communities at the DBSA programs are interested in doing this work together. And are we going to be able to see if there are survivors who want to be participants in creating this network? And I think it's just it's been a really interesting process to just give, like from the get-go, just to reach out and connect from one call, and from there to be able to see where people want to engage together and what do they want to be working around, and to really be able to provide space for some of those stereotypes within our work to be dissembled, and to really like be able to give honor to where people are at, and to create space for them to do something that might not be traditional for them. So that's been one thing that I have just loved to participate in, is just to see how people are willing to connect. And now we have SARTs forming in each of the 5 state facilities across Wyoming, and that all started from a phone call. And I don't know that that's possible everywhere else, right? So that's, I think, just focusing on the strengths and the way that we connect with one another really leads the work and leads the success that we're able to see.
Thanks, Katie. I really appreciate that example, and I think that really speaks to opportunities, really regardless of where your SART is. Sometimes we have an intention to do this type of work, but the opportunity to do a different type of work based on, like you said, a phone call or a connection or a conversation really presents itself, and it's really up to us as a team or as individuals to recognize when those opportunities come to us or when they appear and, follow that road wherever it leads us. Marsha, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think they summed that up quite well. The only thing that I would add is that the opportunities for rural SARTs are endless. Sometimes it takes strategically thinking outside of the box and being creative to build those relationships that make way for those opportunities. But honestly, it's just, those rural SARTs are the driving force to where they want sexual assault services to go. And so I believe that the opportunities are endless.
Thanks. I really appreciate that. The sharing of the positivity around the opportunities and the SART work. All right. So I know we've talked a little bit about some of the ways that rural SARTs might have to think differently about the way that they do their work. And we wanted to ask you today if you had any tips or thoughts about getting from here to there, and that could be getting from here to there literally. Are you implementing, using technology in order to have meetings? Are you having remote meetings? Are you putting, extra funding into categories in order to make sure that, travel is possible, or traveling more in warm weather instead of cold weather, right, in order to facilitate everyone safely getting to meetings? And kind of figuratively, too, like how do we get from here to there? When a lot of SARTs begin meeting, there might be, minimal trust. We're all really trying to build relationships. We're trying to get to know each other. And, how do we get from here to there? Either, tips in that area where that's really literal, like getting together might be one of the biggest conversations, right, that you might have to have. Or how do we get from here to there as a community and, in the relationship building? And Katie, do you want to talk about that one?
Yes. I think we get from here to there through trust and presence. And so Wyoming's huge, and it costs a lot of money to travel, right? And we have to put a lot of resources into that. But I think it's really important that we build in the structure into the work that we're doing so that we are able to be present with communities as they're developing SART teams. So that's just a structural thing, like making sure that it's written into our grants, making sure that it's a priority with our funders so that they know, like, we are going to make sure that our presence is valued and that we are able really to just bear witness to that process physically, if at all possible, right? But then when it's not possible and snowstorms happen or whatever else might be coming up and we can't travel, that we have a way to still connect that's built on kind of habit, I would say, so that like when we're connecting with pilot communities, we try to do it always through Google Hangouts, so that we have that face-to-face connection, and they still are able to recognize us in a community, even if we haven't actually met physically before. So that's one thing, is finding ways to be present with one another and building it into the structure of our work. So whether we're meeting every week or every month, just as coordinators facilitating the process, or if we're meeting quarterly, that we're making sure that we have built-in structures that we're able to just be present with one another. And then the other piece of that is really the trust, right, and recognizing that people and domestic violence sexual assault programs are going through different things at different times, and that I might have my own agenda for a timeline within a year's work, right? But that maybe something happens in that community and their director resigns or their advocates move to different positions, and the ups and downs that just come from part of being in this work, to really stay present throughout that, even if we're not working around SART things. So we had one of our pilot communities whose director did leave, and almost all of their staff left within last year as well. So my role then transitioned from SART coordinator to really support person, right, for the program as they went through that transition. And then now coming back into the work after they have a more stable staff is recognizing, okay, here is where we are, and how do we want to move forward together, and really establishing that trust so they know that I'm not here for just the SART team, but I am here for them as a whole program, as a whole community, and the ups and downs that come with doing this work in trauma. So yeah, I would just say that it's building trust and then finding really creative ways to be present with one another.
Thanks, Katie. Marsha, do you want to share some of your experiences around getting from here to there?
Yes, absolutely. I think at the start, you just have to assess where you are and decide where you want to go. And in doing that, you would develop a mission statement and work within the people that you have at the table and respect the roles and responsibilities of each person at the table. When holding meetings, I mean, come on, none of us want to just go to another meeting. We already have schedules that are taxed. Make the agendas for those meetings prominent and the content relevant to what you're working on. And communication. Communication is key when you're building a collaboration like a SART team. Communicate with each other. Have multiple facilitators. Rather than speaking at the people, make it an open dialogue. A lot of times the members on the SART team will all speak up and you'll just start seeing from the communication at that table that you'll see the SART form and you'll hear people say, oh, well, so-and-so is not here. We need to get so-and-so here. And well, that person makes the decisions at that hospital. Let's get them at the table. And you'll see the wings slowly develop and then you'll see the SART fly.
Thanks. I love that reminder about communication too. Johnanna, was there anything you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch base on one thing related to physically getting from here to there, and then a couple things related to building those relationships and trust getting from here to there. So I'll start with the easy one because the physical stuff is somewhat easier. So when we're thinking about getting from here to there, there's some basic stuff like Katie was talking about with structure. There's some really basic stuff that you can do to help alleviate the burden. So especially for communities where a single county is 400 square miles, right? So when we're thinking about our SARTs and how and when we are meeting, there are things you can do like rotate the location of your meeting. So, for example, there was a community in Wisconsin where the county was more or less square-ish shaped, because counties are never a very normal shape, more or less square-ish shaped, and the advocacy program was up in the upper left corner, and the rest of the community, the big town, was actually in the lower left corner, or excuse me, lower right corner. So opposite ends of the county, right? And so they had their meeting in that larger town every single month, and the advocacy group often couldn't get there because it was just a really long drive, and they had a very small number of advocates on call at any given time. And so there are things you can do like rotate the location of your meeting. Right, so take turns on who has to travel and when, and being really cognizant of who has to travel. So we have kind of a running joke here at SPJ and the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, because we work in conjunction with them. We have this running joke of like the road goes both ways. So for a long time, we've habitually asked people to come to us in a major metropolitan area. But over time, we've really started to have the conversation of like, wow, we can go north, or we can go west, or we can go south too, because we're on the very eastern edge of the state. So we can go all these places. The road goes both directions. Fancy that. So that's something I always try to remind people of, like, have the opportunity to rotate. You can also do things like have subcommittees, right? So where maybe your SART meets every single month. And maybe you just have your major SART, like the big full meeting once a month, and then on the second month, on the even months, if you will, right, you have a subcommittee where it's easier for them to get to one another for whatever reason, or they can do their work over a Google Hangout like Katie was talking about, or Skype, or whatever, teleconferencing, or even just over like good old-fashioned like phone conferencing. Whatever it is, like think about what you're asking of people and how you can really figure out who can afford to be gone and when, and how can we help them meet that challenge. So the second part that I just want to add on to, particularly when thinking about the relationship building, is that, and this is going to be like a hard real talk moment that I've been thinking a lot about lately, we have to talk about power within our SARTs.
Mm-hmm.
So often I have a SART leader who's an advocate in either, victim witness advocate or an advocate in a community agency. Regardless, they're an advocate. And so when I do trainings, I always have folks talk about what is the pyramid of power, right? Amongst the folks who are active on a SART agency. So when someone walks in, who's the top of the pyramid? Who has the absolute most power, who can decide for other people, who can impose their will, right? And when we start talking about it, most of the time people talk about it's usually a prosecutor or a district attorney. The next people down are usually law enforcement, and then medical providers, and probations and corrections, and when we get down the list, we finally get to advocates. Are always. I have yet to go to a single training, and I've done a lot of them at this point. I have yet to attend a single training where anyone says it's someone other than advocates at the bottom of the pyramid of power that we operate in every single day. And so part of that trust building, part of that relationship building, part of that getting from here to there is having the people in power be able and willing to talk about that they are the folks in power. And how do we manage that power in a really meaningful way? So that way when the prosecutor talks, everyone doesn't just quietly go, yep, absolutely, agree, when they might not actually agree. So we have to really start addressing power differentials in a meaningful way. And there's lots of ways to do that. It's all really difficult. Like, I'm just going to acknowledge that. It's really hard. And especially if you're an advocate SART leader, it's even harder because you're the person with the least hierarchical power in the room asking others to give up their power, whether they realize they have it or not. So in all of that, there's a million ways to do that. It might seem really hard. It can feel a little hopeless. You don't have to just be grateful people showed up, because I hear that all the time of how folks are just like, oh my gosh, I'm just so happy they were there. They were on their phone the whole time. They didn't contribute once, but they were in the room. It's okay to ask more of your partners. And if they're not willing, then you need to think about, how can I go about, back to one of the previous points we've all talked about, how can I do amazing work with the people who want to do it with me? What great changes can I make? Instead of just spending my energy trying so hard to get someone there and being so grateful that they showed up but didn't help at all. So I just really wanted to hit that hard, because it's been a conversation that has come up a lot in the last couple of weeks with my technical assistants in a way that it's just been, real forefront to my brain. And then the other thing is, part of that relationship building is actually do stuff. Like both, I'm pretty sure Katie and Marsha have already talked about, we all have jam-packed schedules. No one is there to meet just to meet. So even if that's just a relation, not even just, quote, right? If it is a relationship building meeting, like Marsha said, put that agenda front and center. We are here to establish relationships and understand the unique roles and responsibilities for every single person, right? Give that meeting a purpose and a job every single time. And then at the end of that meeting, say, did we meet that job? Did this meeting serve its purpose? As a way to help people really focus in and understand that we're doing things together. We're not meeting just to meet. And that goes a long way for a lot of people.
Thanks, Johnanna. I really appreciate that really powerful kind of hard talk. And I want to cross-reference another resource here. I think one of the things that may contribute to the disempowerment of advocates, both in perception of other members and maybe advocates themselves, is the idea of what an advocate's role is on a SART. And there's a webinar that we recorded on confidentiality that's part of the SART Toolkit webinar series. And it really drives home an advocate's role, which is not to share victims' information. And their real intention to share the multitude of voices of survivors and call attention to a lot of the systemic problems and a lot of the things that they're hearing from the community. And it's not about sharing a specific survivor's information. And I just want to put that out there because I think that is a really good resource. If this is something that your SART is struggling with, I'd really recommend listening to that as well. Not that that's the entire answer, but I think that's one of the things I hear very frequently about that. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, too. I, again, just really want to reiterate the concept that came up a couple of times as all of you were talking was that you really weren't blaming another member in the sense that you weren't saying, like, why is this person not showing up? And you really said, like, how can I help support this person show up, and recognizing that. And I just think that that is so essential, right? Recognizing that there are, situations or that people might need resources, and that's huge, right? So starting from that place of compassion and recognition can really change the entire dynamic of a team and really change who can show up. And Johnanna, because I added to that really powerful comment you made, I just want to double check with you to make sure that I didn't kind of ad-lib there in a way that took away from what you were saying. So I just want to give you a moment to maybe respond or add to that if you felt that was necessary.
Nope, we're good.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much.
Can I add a little bit there?
Absolutely.
I think it's when we're talking about power and how our SARTs are constructed, and if SARTs are constructed like out of the already hierarchical power structures, then that SART then just embeds that right into its own structure, right? And kind of then perpetuates that power and control over just because of like the way that people are engaging around power and the fear that can come up with there, or the vulnerability that's not able to be present because of the hierarchy, right? And then how then do survivors feel supported in a SART that is really perpetuating that power and control structure? And so I think it's really important, like as we're thinking about forming SARTs and we're thinking about doing things in a different way, to find ways that in and of themselves deconstruct that power. So like whether it's having your SART come together in circle process, like through the circle process, to meet in circle where every voice has the same democratic value as another, right? And that everyone gets to speak their turn and has that level playing field. I think it's really important to try to figure out how can we deconstruct that power in and of itself so that there isn't necessarily that dynamic coming on, and that we're giving power to where it's most needed, right, which is for survivors and for the community themselves, not for us who already have access to so much privilege within the system. And so I think it's really like we can take that power conversation and we can really live it, right? Like I think our SARTs really need to take the time to figure out what that means to do that deconstruction of power from the normal way of being together. And that's huge. I think the power there, right, is huge to think about doing something in a new way to really transform social change within communities.
Thank you so much, Katie, for adding that. I really appreciate it. I think that conversation really ties into the next question that I have for all of you. And I really wanted to know how your SARTs form goals in their community. And that could be, how do you get together to form, the vision, mission, statements, and, how does that work, right? Does your SART really hold to that? And I think in a lot of the conversations that I'm having, and I'm really glad that John and you brought it up, was that really thinking about the idea of, equity, access are really influencing those mission statements. But like, what are those goals? How do you form those goals? How do you have those conversations? What do they look like? And what are things that you should be considering? And do you revise them? Do you review them? And what does that look like? And Marsha, we haven't heard from you in a little while, so I wanted to give you the opportunity to start off with the answer to this question.
Okay, I would have to say that goals are formed when need is identified, especially among rural SARTs. I mean, if you look at the response to sexual assault in your particular area, that in itself is going to form your goals. where are we now? Where do we want to go? And in setting those goals, it's going to take all of the service providers who are providing those services, someone from the points of entry where the victims are presenting to say, okay, this is our response now. This is what we want our response to be. So what are the middle steps, the middle ground for getting us there? And that forms your goals and then can identify a clear mission statement for your SART team. One thing that I would like to say and say it loud is don't just set goals and let them be the goals that carry out forever. Those goals constantly need to be reevaluated because legislations change, laws change, needs change, victims' needs are constantly changing. At least annually, those goals need to be reevaluated and determine, okay, we've come to this far. Where do we want to go now? Rather, a lot of times I will see teams just create goals and 15 years from now, they'll pull those goals out and they'll realize that they've gone in several different directions and without having gone back and looked at reevaluating those goals.
Thanks. And Katie, do you want to tell us how that has worked in your community?
Yeah. Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yes. It sounds like Katie's having a tech issue, but Johnanna, oh.
Hello?
Katie?
Hi.
Yeah, we can hear you now. You can go for it. Thank you.
Sorry, I was having mute issues. Yeah, so Johnanna actually taught me once, I think it must have been at the SCGI Institute, but that evaluation doesn't need to be like super formal, right? It doesn't have to be a peer-reviewed process necessarily. It can be you walking into someone's office and asking them to share their experience with you and to see what their needs are. And that kind of reminds me of something Strong Oak said, and she said, live as if everything has a story to tell. And I have really kind of internalized that into how we are working and evaluating and really trying to figure out what our goals are, is what is our story? What is the collective story within our community around sexual violence? And whose story haven't we heard yet? And what do we need to be hearing? And how do we create space for that? And so what's something really creative that one community has done is to bring survivors together around digital storytelling through photo voice, to really talk about what is their collective story, and then out of that, what are the needs and the response that they want to see moving forward, and really what's this change that they want to create. And I think that is really phenomenal, because then people get to hear, like, both the survivors get to hear their shared experience, right? So they get to hear that it's not just them alone, but that there are norms in their experience that kind of are perpetuated within the community. And then they get to identify how they want to move forward to address that. And then the SART team, it's like a way to speak truth to power, right? The SART team gets to hear and create the space for them to really embed practices and protocols from those listening sessions into their team and into the work that they're doing. So I would say, like, don't feel afraid to, like evaluation for me was really intimidating because I hadn't gone through that process before in a really structured academic way, right? And so I was just so appreciative of the space Johnanna had given to say, like, evaluation doesn't need to be so formal. You can really go through and get answers to your questions while still doing really deep level relationship building. And then at the same time, like, there's the aspect that evaluation needs to be tracked and measured, right? Like, that there is structure that is beneficial from that. And so especially as you're tracking, like, are these protocols that we've developed effective, then to be able to develop something that is more measured, more traditionally measured, I guess, in that way, so that we know that what we're doing isn't harmful.
Thanks, Katie. Johnanna, do you want to jump in? Do you have any thoughts about forming goals and mission for SART?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of already been said, but just to reiterate the point, missions and goals are kind of the heart of the SART. It's the thing that keeps moving us forward, and particularly when thinking about your mission. And every SART should have a mission. I'm just throwing it out there. I know it really does help because a mission works as a compass, right? And a compass isn't complicated. It's not big. It's not lengthy. It is a very simple tool to say what direction are we going. And so when you're thinking about your mission should only answer 3 questions. Who are you? What do you do? Who benefits as a result of your work? Right? So a very simple version of that would be, I'm Johnanna Ganz. I'm a rural projects coordinator working to support SART teams across the U.S. and the U.S. territories. That's who I am. That's what I do. That's who's going to benefit as a direct result of my work. Right? Of course, there's much more benefit, but that's the simple version. And so when we think about our teams, and I actually just went through this process with a team that's forming here in Minnesota, one of the things that I help them try to understand when they're writing this mission is I first ask them on an index card, write one question you want answered through a SART. Like, let's say you're going to build it. We're in the process. We're here having this organizing meeting right now. What's a question you want answered? And then on the flip side, what is one outcome that you want to see? And I asked them when talking about their outcomes to have them be really grounded in very realistic, measurable things. Ideally, of course, we all want to see an end to sexual violence. The truth of the matter is the SART is one strategy to get there. A SART alone will not end sexual violence. Like, it's just a thing. I'm so sorry if that makes me sound like a pessimist, but we need many strategies to tackle the issue of sexual violence in our communities. And the SART is just one strategy. And so we need lots of auxiliary help in that. So I asked them to do one outcome that they want to see. And this helped frame up a lot of the kinds of work that they wanted to do, because when they had their questions, they were talking about knowledge gaps. They were talking about the ways that they wanted to work better together. They were talking about all the stuff that they didn't know about victim survivor experiences in their community. And when we were talking about their outcomes, they were talking about all the ways that they want to see the work get better and have a better result for victim survivors. So that really helps build up both mission and goals. And so from there, we actually walked through the 3 questions: who are you, what do you do, who's going to benefit? And we were able to really locate, when we had these conversations looking at questions and goals, we could really locate the heart of a team was to increase interagency cooperation in pursuit of better outcomes and more justice for victim survivors. And they didn't come to that by magic, right? Like, there were some folks that said, I'm really here to improve our interagency cooperation. I'm here to see that offenders get what's coming to them. And we can talk about that later, right? But it was really through this conversation and through what they were hoping to do and what they wanted to know, we could really, the conversation, I didn't even push it. The conversation eventually came to among these service providers of like, okay, interagency cooperation, but to what end? For victim survivors. And that was awesome. And so when we're think about that outcome question when you want to think about some of your goals. And of course, like both Katie and Marsha said, get input, learn from victim survivors. Without them, you do not know what needs to change. Like, hard stop, no argument on that. You don't know what needs to change if you haven't talked to victim survivors in your community. And not just the victim survivors who come into your agency. All victim survivors. And not just victim survivors that meet a specific demographic. All victim survivors in your community. And that's going to mean that you're going to have to make a lot of edits and changes. And you're going to have to think about being culturally responsive. And you're going to have to figure out how to decenter particularly issues like whiteness and being straight and being Christian and like all the things that kind of stay in the center of our world in a lot of ways. So we have to learn from these victim survivors. And so that gives you a lot of information about your goals. In addition, asking the questions, how will things be different as a result of our team's work in the next year and in the next 5 years, to give yourself kind of short-term and long-term goals, and say, like, what do you actually, like, let's say I came to your team in 1 year from today. What will you want to tell me that you accomplished? In 5 years, if I come back and say, when I come back and say, what'd you do? You're going to be able to tell me X, Y, and Z in 5 years. And then the other question that you can really ask is, what do you want all victim survivors to be able to say about the criminal justice process in your community? Because so many SARTs are focused on criminal justice. And there are, of course, alternative routes. And there's, like Katie was talking about, circle processes and restorative justice, right? Most SARTs are designed to deal with the criminal justice system. So what do you want all victim survivors to be able to say? And that can help pick some of your goals initially until you start getting the feedback from all victim survivors. Then you can really ground folks in action and implementation plans, because that's the other piece about goals. A goal is useless without an implementation plan of deciding how long it's going to take you, who's going to do what work and when are the deadlines due by, what other information or resources do you have but don't have yet, need but don't have yet, what are the resources that are currently available. So really get practical, and that's like my life's motto, be real practical. So those are some of the ways that you can form missions, goals, and really get information and feedback. And it's really important that we stay at every step of the way focused on victim survivors, because especially when we're working with systems collaboration, especially when you put in that hierarchy of power that I previously talked about, it can be really easy. And I'm going to admit it, I was guilty of it as a SART leader more than once. I started collaborating on behalf of what was easiest for me or my agency or the system rather than on what was best for victim survivors. And of course, I like snapped out of it pretty quick and saw, like, as soon as I walked away from whatever conversation it was, I'd be like, ooh, woof, that wasn't great, right? And so then I'd have to follow up and say, like, okay, so I know I agreed to this X, Y, and Z. I think we also need to consider this other thing over here. And it's just really important that you're just deeply honest with yourselves and your team and say, like, we got to keep focused on what matters most. And we got to collaborate on behalf of improving work for victim survivors, because if not for them, then for who?
Thank you so much for sharing that. I really love that idea of kind of the compass, guiding your SART work. And I think, Johnanna, you might have answered my next question in some ways. You're thinking about how you incorporate survivor voices into your SART and how you make sure that your compass, really is intentionally on survivors. One exercise that I think is kind of interesting, and when you meet with a SART, and you can do this with your SARTs at home too, is walk into a room and ask everybody to write down what their goal, their mission, or their vision is. And if your team has an established one, it could be a really interesting way to see if that's something that is, one, everyone knows about it, two, if it's something that is, really front and center, right? So when you're navigating, you really need that compass all the time. And if people can't articulate kind of the easy way that Johnanna just did, what their mission goals and who that benefits, then that might be an indication that that's something the SART needs to put on an agenda and really work through. And again, there's a lot of resources in the toolkit for how SARTs can do that. But I really want to talk, again, really about how to incorporate survivor voices into SARTs. And Katie, will you talk about how you really center survivors and incorporate their feedback and have that kind of continued focus in your SART work?
Yeah, so I think it's really just echoing what Johnanna has already said, because that was so eloquently stated and so very true, right? Hard stop. Survivors need to be involved. And whoever is going to be impacted by the decision-making process, by our protocols, and really what we're creating together, they need to be involved in that process in leadership and in the sustainability of change. So, like, survivors are the reason we're doing this, right? We're working to end violence, and we're working so that people don't have to continue to experience sexual violence. And I think survivors know most what they need for change and how they want to be supported. And so creating that space for them to be part of leadership and sustainability, and really creating the community network around like why it's important, like getting their voices heard throughout the community, so the community isn't able to be in that place of denial anymore, right? So really leading that as an effort for both prevention, but also as an effort of support and response as well. So part of that is like being creative with how you're hearing survivors, inviting them in through things like photo voice, or having them lead your meetings, finding ways that they want to engage. So getting storytelling processes out there in statewide conferences, right? So we're able to hear on wide scale from survivors of what they're experiencing in different communities, so that other communities are able to also share in that knowledge, I think is really important. And then to understand like what survivors aren't there. So are the survivors we're hearing from representative of our entire community, or are they particular to a certain race or class, right? And so if we're thinking about who we're hearing from, I think it's also important to understand who we're not hearing from, and then how can we reach out and make sure that we're meaningfully connecting with those survivors as well. And recognizing, too, that there's harm there, right? Like we're not connecting with groups of people because there's not a relationship of trust, and for good reason. And then really being real with that and really figuring out what does that mean for us as a community, and how do we walk forward together. And those aren't easy questions for SARTs to answer. There's a lot of pain there and a lot of discomfort sometimes, but I think it's really important that we understand that that is our work. It's fundamentally our work, and we're not going to be successful until we figure out how to do that well. I also would say that it's possible, right? Like I think people are in a place of aching for change and aching to figure it out and aching to step into these crucial conversations in a way that is respectful and full of dignity, while also recognizing that there's real change that is needed here, and we have all that we need to move forward together already. It's really just having the courage to step into it and to do it, and to recognize that we're not always going to do it right? But we can't just stay where we are.
Thanks, Katie. Marsha, do you have any examples or practical tips of how you include survivor voices in your SART work?
Absolutely. I am a big fan of the saying, if you want to know what people need, ask them. We at FRIS had developed with some collaborative partners, developed a disability toolkit. And in doing that, in the very beginning, we formed focus groups with actual survivors of sexual assault that have disabilities. And we asked them, what did you encounter as you went through the system? Tell us what your experience was. And we based our modules in that toolkit off of the feedback that we gained from that knowledge from those survivors. We should not be developing services without survivors' voices. They are the ones who are experiencing the system, interacting with the individuals in the system. And without their voices, I don't think any services would be completely successful.
Great, thank you. And Johnanna, I know you shared a lot about the importance of getting survivors' voices. Will you talk to us a little bit about some of the practical ways that you go about making sure that you are either able to access those voices or including those voices in your work?
Absolutely. I've seen a number of ways that communities have included victim survivors in meaningful ways and really bringing their voices forward through the SART work. So there are things like informational group interviews, or I think Marsha just talked about focus groups. There are things like a victim survivors council or advisory committee, where victim survivors don't come to every single meeting, but rather there is this quarterly meeting of the Victim Survivors Council or Advisory Committee, or a Victim Survivors Subcommittee, where they get to look at and talk about what the SART is working on and provide meaningful feedback. And that's actually a really great solution And this is where I will throw in my one word of caution. I have worked with a number of SARTs who have invited victim survivors to sit on the team, and it has I have not seen a ton of examples where it goes particularly well, because when you ask a victim survivor to come just as a victim survivor to come to a monthly meeting, one, they have jobs that are outside of the criminal justice system, which can be hard, or lives, not just jobs, lives outside of the criminal justice system, and that can be a little bit hard. They might not be able to get time off, etc. In addition, there's a danger in having only a single story of a victim survivor present. We've all talked about you need to get all victim survivors. You need to listen to the voices you're not listening to. And especially the victim survivors that often get invited to the SART are people who've tried to go through or have gone through the criminal justice system. We know, based on research, the majority will never make it to or through the criminal justice system. And so when we think about victim survivors and we think about including their voices, we have to be sure to be getting a breadth of voices. We also have to be sure that we're setting our SART up for success. And that includes for the victim survivor you've asked to be present, but also for service providers, especially if the service provider sitting at the table is the person who handled that case, right? That's going to set them up to have a hard time to talk honestly and openly about decisions that have been made. And if we want to change things, we have to have SART members who are willing to talk honestly and openly, which is why I make the recommendation for informational group interviews, survivors council, advisory committees, subcommittees. You can do things like listening sessions, or like Katie talked about with photo voice. You can collect surveys. There are literally endless ways to get victim survivors involved that don't necessarily include having a single victim survivor be a representative for all survivors on a SART. Additionally, that victim survivor can't make any changes to any agency policy or individual practice or protocol. So we really have to ask who's attending our SART and why, and how is their information benefiting us. I have seen SARTs invite victim survivors for a single meeting, like a feedback meeting. That has worked well. I've seen there are some cases where they invite a single victim survivor whose case is being discussed. That can be really challenging for a lot of victim survivors. It's worked well in a couple of cases, but that's a way to get some feedback. The other thing that I really want to encourage people to think about when we think about survivor voices in our SART, the people on our teams, there's a good chance you have a survivor working in a discipline on your team. So when we think about particularly talking about survivors on teams, I've had some folks be like, well, I'm a victim survivor and I'm a SART member, so don't we have a survivor voice on the team? Yes and no. You absolutely are a survivor. You absolutely are on a SART, but you're not there to speak on behalf of the victim survivors in the community, right? You're there to speak on behalf of advocacy or on law enforcement or on probation or the faith community or colleges and universities. You're there for that purpose. You're not there as the victim survivor in the room trying to provide the victim survivor vision and voice and experience. So when you're talking about survivors on your teams, this is also just like a gentle word of caution. Think about who's on your team. And when we say we don't have any survivors on our team, that might impact people negatively, right? So kind of some things to balance out. But long story short, just to reiterate everything we've all said here, there's so many ways to do it. It's so essential that you do it. And I'm pretty sure I can speak for all four of us and say, get a hold of us and we can talk you through how we've done it or seen it done, because it is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, thank you to everybody. I really appreciate all of your thoughtful comments. Thinking about really centering survivors, I think we hear all the time from SARTs is really the idea of how do we keep, survivors' information confidential or private, and we hear frequently this comment in rural communities is in my community, everyone knows everyone. So do you have any hints or tips for folks really knowing that we need to value survivors' wishes in any situation, particularly around their private information and their confidential information, but recognizing that in a rural community there might be additional things to think about in order to make sure that that information really is protected for folks and within that meeting. Kate, can I turn it over to you to start us off with the way that that works in your community?
Yeah. So confidentiality, it's such a big thing, right? And I think it's so true that in small communities, everyone does know everyone. And that can be a weakness and a strength. And it's really important to figure out how do we approach it as a strength. So in rural Wyoming, we've experienced a thing where people really want to help each other, right? They want to help each other do a good job. And sharing information would be an easy way to do that. But we've had to be pretty firm in our technical assistance to say that opens you up. Like, we appreciate the value in that and where that's coming from. But that's opening you up to a lot of liability with your funders, but also a lot of safety risk with survivors. And so the important thing that we need to focus on as a strength is creating that culture of care within our professions so that the SART team itself understands each professional's confidentiality responsibilities, and then they're able to help keep everyone responsible to those responsibilities in a way that doesn't kind of push those boundaries, right? So that confidentiality is still maintained as inherently valuable to survivors and to the organizations that we're working with, so that we're not opening ourselves up to liability risk or survivors to safety risks. So it's really helping each other keep those boundaries strong, recognizing that we are really connected, and like oftentimes, like if a police officer has just dropped off a survivor to a program, the program wants to share information with them because they're like, yeah, they know that they're here. They know that they're receiving advocacy. They just walked through my doors, right? But really making sure that those officers understand that they don't know anything beyond that point, right? And how can we make sure that we're keeping those boundaries healthy and really creating that culture of care within our small communities to support one another.
Thanks, Kate. I really appreciate that. Marsha, would you like to talk about that in your community and with your SART?
Yes, absolutely. In small communities, everyone does know everyone. And as Katie said, and I'll reiterate, that can be perceived as both a weakness and a strength. What I will say that has worked for us in our communities is training on confidentiality and what exactly confidentiality is. We have members of our SART team sign confidentiality agreements. Some do a blanket confidentiality agreement that will last for 1 month, and then they will revisit that. SART members all of the SART members aren't present for all of those conversations. It's okay if you're going to be discussing cases that not all of the members that attend all of your SART meetings are present. You can have sort of an ex parte SART meeting to do some of those detailed case discussions. Bring to the table at those meetings just the people who need to know that information to make those decisions. Some of the things that's also worked for us is training your media. A lot of times the media are the one who gives away an identification by posting the incident in the paper because they state an identifying factor, and everybody knows that because of that one factor that was printed, that who that victim is. Train your community, train your SART members, train your service providers on what truly confidentiality means. I can't reiterate enough, just training. And from my experience over the last 11 years, yes, there is some confidentiality that is broken or breached, but in a lot of cases, even in the small communities, there is the possibility of having anonymity if it's done correctly.
Thanks. Johnanna, do you have any tips or practical things that you'd like to add?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple things, particularly around confidentiality in rural communities and spaces, particularly when you're meeting as a SART. You need to figure out what is necessary to discuss. So I work with a lot of SARTs on this particular issue. In a SART meeting, do you actually have to speak about case identifying information? 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. You do not have to speak about case identifying information to be able to talk about what you're really trying to get to as a SART, which is the response, right? So I don't have to talk about where it was or who it was with or the age of the victim. I don't have to talk about any of that most of the time to be able to say, like, okay, so we got a call. I went out to the call. These are some of the questions I asked. This is the protocol that I followed. I didn't call an advocate. I didn't call the medical, right? Like, I didn't do any of that, right? And that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to refocus the information we're talking about. It is rare that a SART has to talk about case identifying information. They do have to talk about their response, and we can talk about the response without case identifying information. So anytime we are talking about case identifying information, you have to be able to honestly answer, what is the purpose of sharing case identifying information? Why are we doing it? Does the victim survivor directly benefit as a result? If not, then we need to take a hard pause and ask, then who is benefiting? And this is one of those moments where I previously talked about when we collaborate on behalf of a system rather than on behalf of the victim survivor. And if we can't explain how it specifically helps that victim survivor with that case information to get better justice, service, etc., then there's a really good chance we're collaborating on behalf of our system. So we got to really look closely at that. The other thing that I want to talk about, particularly with the waivers, release of information, so ROIs, or confidentiality waivers, every single time you talk about case identifying information, you need to have had a release of information and that confidentiality waiver, that confidentiality agreement in place. And every single time, there's very clear guidelines under VAWA funding, SASP funding, and there's one more stop. I'm going to triple check that. But there's very clear guidelines about what a release of information is, how long it can be active, and what purpose it serves. And in that release of information that you're asking from a victim survivor, it has to state how information is being shared, for what purpose it's being shared, and how long that release is good for. And they recommend no more than 30 days, right? Even in that, you have to ask yourself, how is asking this victim survivor to allow me to talk freely about their case identifying information, how is that benefiting them? And if you can't answer that, that's again that time where you really have to go back and ask yourself, why do I need to share case identifying information? Because when we don't do that, when we don't have waivers in place, or we just have long-term blanket confidentiality agreements, that runs the risk of putting people open to losing their funding if they get federal funds because they're not following best practices, and it opens them up to being sued, right? Especially if you have service providers that are bound by professional ethics, state laws and legislation that says they have to protect certain information. If they're not doing that, that opens up agencies to liability and lawsuit. So that to me is a great opportunity to ask, how do we keep confidentiality? Do we need to talk about case identifying information? And if we don't, then let's focus really on what are we doing in our response. The last thing that I will say with confidentiality, particularly if you have an exceptionally small community, I was just talking with some groups up in Alaska where they sometimes connect with outside programs because they know no one in the community is not somehow related to or in relationship with another person. So they outsource their services as a way to make sure that people can have truly confidential and anonymous help and information. So that might be something that you think about as a SART, especially if you're in an extraordinarily small or tight-knit community. How can you get outside? How can you make agreements with outside communities to be able to provide that information if they need it, and to provide those services if they need it? So there's lots of ways you can do and protect confidentiality in rural communities. I'm very much with Marsha and Katie on this one. You can absolutely do it.
Thanks. Johnanna, would you talk a little bit about the liability, the federal liability and the funding liability that SARTs have around confidentiality?
Yes. So particularly for folks who are advocates, right, we all are bound by privilege, right? And that means that we protect confidential information and we cannot provide it without the express written permission of a victim survivor. And in the absence of written, we can do like over the phone, and then we have a bunch of people, right, observe it and sign it, and they all agree that this happened. So particularly with any kind of liability around that, so if you're an advocate sharing confidential information, whether you mean to or not, and that gets back to a victim survivor, they have the right to pursue your agency for a failure to protect information that they didn't have the right to talk about. Same with medical care providers, right? There's the ever-looming HIPAA. If we violate HIPAA, people have the right to sue that their information that was promised to be protected, that we signed a bunch of waivers, even though it's tiny print, no one can read 20 pages that fast, right? Like, that information is agreed to be held in confidence and only shared for direct service reasons. So that opens you up for that kind of liability. It also just destroys your credibility within a community, right? Like, survivors aren't going to come to your establishment, your agency, if they know that you talk, even if you don't mean to. If they know that that's happening, it decreases their ability to access service, and a SART is all about increasing access to service, particularly around funding. So if you accept federal funds, VAWA VOCA, it wasn't STOP, it was VOCA. It's VAWA VOCA and SASP. I'm going to triple check this again. Thanks, brain, for not remembering immediately when I need you to. So if you accept these federal funds, part of the agreements, if you look closely, nearly all of the grant fund agreements talk about protecting victim survivor information. And so if you fail to protect victim survivor information, they have the right to revoke funding because you didn't protect survivor information, which is an essential part of the grant agreement. So you got to be really, really careful with that. So if any agency on your team is receiving those funds, you got to be really good about protecting confidential and case identifying information. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I think, again, I'm going to refer to that confidentiality webinar, and then there are a couple technical assistance providers nationally that specifically will help with this confidentiality issue, right? And I think it's one of those things that SARTs, particularly because we know there's a lot of turnover, we know people get promotions, we know people get burnout, that this is the kind of thing that our habits can really take over our, legal and ethical responsibilities, and we should be receiving training on this at least yearly. And those technical assistance providers are available on the SART Toolkit, and I really refer you to look at that list. And if you have any questions or concerns, really reach out to the people that can help support your team. I'm going to jump. Our last slide here, I think we're going to talk about is case review. And I know confidentiality really comes into case review a lot, but Marsha, will you talk to us a little bit about the way case review works, and how you're looking for those patterns, and what information you're really trying to discover when you do that case review, and whether you're doing active case review of a current case, or whether your SARTs that you work with are typically looking at closed cases that might have been in the past and might not actually include anyone who's currently at the table.
Okay, sure, I will try. Case review looks different in every single community that I work with. Some of our communities don't do them because they are scared to death. When they hear case review, they hear breach of confidentiality. So they steer clear of it because they're so afraid of breaching confidentiality. I think that word HIPAA has made everybody nervous through the years, that some places don't realize that you can actually discuss elements of a case without disclosing confidential information. Excuse me, and that is what SART teams should be doing. I don't think we're doing any service to our victims if we are not looking at these cases to see what works and what isn't working, where the holdups are, where the barriers are, and where the successes are. I think if we're coming to the table and we're looking at those elements, we're looking at, okay, this person entered the system here, everything flowed smoothly until it got to point B. Then this happened. I don't think that we can correctly evaluate our services and then make those needed changes without doing case review. And there's a lot of tools available out there for doing case review. One of them, Johnanna knows very well as they developed it there. And basically we use that as a guide, and we did a training with our advocates that are providing those facilitating those SART meetings on that very toolkit that came from MNCASA, on proper way to do case reviews and confidentiality. Again, it all comes down to training. Understanding roles and boundaries is a big issue. Not thinking that because you build a relationship between law enforcement and advocacy, that advocates can tell you that little piece of information that you're wanting to know. That's not being respectful of that person's position. Just meeting people where they are at the table and just laying it out. This is what we can talk about. This is what we cannot talk about, and agreeing that no one will cross that boundary.
Thank you. Johnanna or Katie, did either of you want to talk a little bit about case review or provide a really specific example of an outcome that might have happened with case review in a SART you worked with?
Hi, this is Johnanna. I can very, very briefly talk about case review. We actually have someone on staff who specializes in case file review. Just like a quick nutshell, there are so many different types of reviewing case files, and so I first want to put a plug in for that. So there's active case management, there's case presentation, there's something called systems consultation, there's something called case file review, which is a formal thing, and then there's systems review. So there's all different types of review, and if you want help with that, absolutely get a hold of us. We have tools and information around all of this stuff. One of the greatest things that comes out of case file review is when you're doing the formal case file review, when you're looking at many closed cases and you're looking at all these documents, you find what is going well and where things are not. And like Marsha said, you find patterns. And as a direct result of that, so one of the communities that we worked with in case file review, they did not have any kind of protocol in place for anybody. And they said, we're going to do a case file review. We're going to look at everything. And based on what they found in case file review, they were able to write really effective protocols of where cases dropped out and why they dropped out, and looking at the way that reports were being written, and looking at how they referred over to the prosecutor's office and where advocacy, they found all of it. And they wrote really effective protocols as a direct result. So there's lots of other really great reasons and really great outcomes, but I'm going to keep it brief.
Great, thank you. I think we're almost at our very last question of today, which is why do you do SART work? And I think we wanted to wrap up today talking about, what in your experience are the real outcomes of doing SART work, right? I think we've talked a little bit throughout today about some of the challenges and the opportunities, but what are those things that really bring you back to the table, and that really, I think all of you in your own ways are those SART champions, the people who really keep it going and are kind of the magic glue. And I appreciate that as someone who really seeks to support survivors in everything I do, and sometimes that's not the easiest role to have, but you're really the SART champion in a lot of ways. And for you, what is it that kind of motivates you or keeps you going through what sometimes are really difficult, hard, challenging, soul-searching conversations, right? These jobs are different than a lot of jobs that people could have, and that goes for everyone who sits around that table. When we come to that space, we really expect more of people than maybe paper pushing or than following a specific protocol. And what keeps you going and what gets you excited about that? And Katie, do you want to start us off with your thoughts?
Sure. So I do SART work because I think trauma creates a disconnect, right? And sexual violence is literally like a disconnect from one person to another, and that sends ripples through space and time, and in our communities it's really tangible in how it's felt. And then in working in systems that are literally created because of the existence of sexual violence, I think that that disconnect can be felt within our work as well, from one organization to another, or even within our organizations. And like, especially out here in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, just from a home office doing this work, it can feel so isolating. And I feel like having a way to come together to really work through how we repair connectedness in our communities and how we start to prevent sexual violence and how we respond in a way that is meaningful for survivors, that for me is life-giving, and in a way that makes what I do have purpose and meaning. And I feel like seeing the change, like seeing when people come together, and at first, like, there's some awkwardness, and they're not sure what the point is, and they're not sure, like, what their goals are or their vision is, right? And then seeing how they want to really move through and find a different way of doing things and find a way to start to connect with one another and start to connect with their communities. That, for me, is transformational, and it gives me so much hope as a survivor in this work that we can create change, and that we're not doing it alone. Yeah, that's what I got.
Thanks, Katie. Johnanna, do you want to share?
Certainly. When I think about why do I do SART work, so I stopped. I'm going to try to make this very brief because it's so complicated. Doing direct service work was really amazing, but I realized I was always on the responding end. Like, the damage was already so present and done. One of the reasons I do SART work and why I was drawn to SART work is because I have the opportunity, while I'm still on the responding end and the sexual violence has already occurred, all those extra layers of damage and healing and disconnect, as Katie was talking about, they don't have to happen, and I can be part of, and the people that I surround myself with and work with every day are all part of having the power and the vision to make sure that there isn't further harm. And like, I have seen extraordinary changes for communities and teams who are really willing to do the hard work of changing practice, policy, and protocols. And it takes a long time. This is not short work. This is not something that you get done in a year. And so watching SARTs and watching community members and watching service providers truly believe that they can craft new, better realities for everyone involved, and then watching them have that happen because of their hard work and disappointment and sweat and tears and all of that. Like, I don't know of any more inspiring work for me personally. I know there's lots of inspiring work out there, but watching realities change and watching people craft new realities is just, it's outstanding. And also, just another shout out, rural creativity, yo. Like, it is so cool to see the ways that people address these enormous like national and global wide challenges. So it's just, I count myself really lucky. And it's inspiring to watch everyone around me working toward that common vision.
Thanks, Johnanna. Marsha, can you share with us about what motivates you to do this work?
Sure. Why do SART work? Because it is absolutely rewarding. Being a part of something that is capable of being the driving force as to where future sexual assault services is going to go. It doesn't get any more rewarding than that. When you see something that doesn't work, knowing that you can be a part of the team that makes the changes to make sure that it works in the future, that you can lead that team to develop new policies and new procedures for responding to victims of sexual assault, ensuring that victims are not re-traumatized when they enter the system. Just being a part of the SART work is a privilege, and it's self-rewarding.
Thank you. I really appreciate that this theme that change is possible, right? We talk about culture change. We talk about the bold idea of ending sexual violence in one generation, and I really appreciate that all of you, do this work because you see, are part of, and facilitate change. And it's really just really wonderful to hear that is what motivates you to move forward and to keep going. And I know throughout this presentation we have mentioned that you can reach out to us and get in touch with us. And I want to share everybody's contact information here, all of our great presenters today. And as you heard, everybody works in a different rural environment, or in Joanna's case, a lot of different rural environments, right? She's all over the country with TA. And I think, Johnanna, do you want to talk a little bit about your blog before we jump off?
My blog is one of my favorite fun parts of my job. My blog is truly about communicating all of the tools and information and ideas and starting conversation around what's happening for rural SARTs. While any SART can benefit from it, it's really a space dedicated to all the stuff I learn and all the stuff people teach me and have to teach others. And it's really structured to provide concrete and tangible action steps, ideas, concepts, talking points, and there's always a theme for every month. And you can absolutely email me to get on the email list for the blog, or you can check on Wednesdays. I update it on Wednesdays.
Great, thank you so much. And I don't think that I can say thank you to all of you enough for being here today, for sharing your experiences, and for being willing to hear from folks in the field and share those experiences even further. I want to put NSVRC's information up here. We are a national technical assistance provider, so we are happy if you have any questions or want to connect with subject matter experts. If we don't have the answer, we'll definitely refer you to folks like those you heard from on today's webinar. And I just want to remind folks that a lot of the topics that we talked about are covered in the SART Toolkit, and that website is www.nsvrc.org/SART Toolkit. And I really encourage you to check out that website and follow up with any questions that you have, and we're really excited to make sure that you have the resources, tools, and information that you need to really be making those impacts, to be making those changes, and supporting survivors in your community. And I want to say thanks to everyone who's listening, and I hope that the ideas you learned today are things that you can take back to your team, that you can put into practice. And I want to also say thank you to OVC again, because without their funding and their support, this webinar and the entire toolkit would not be possible. So thank you so much, everyone, for all that you do every day to support survivors and hold offenders accountable. Thanks.